following program is a production of the Fairfax Network, Fairfax County Public Schools, funded in part by the Virginia Satellite Educational Network.
This program was made possible through generous support from the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation to George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate and Gardens. Funding a Nation is a co-production of the Fairfax Network and George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate and Gardens.
My friends, it is Mrs. Washington's and my honor to welcome you. We extend our warm and sincere Virginia hospitality to each and every one of you. I think it is appropriate, with your grace and understanding, for each of us to convey, perhaps in our own words, a bit about our own backgrounds. You are all educators, is that what I understand? Yes. The ladies as well? My goodness gracious, things have changed, have they not?
Indeed, quite the improvement, perhaps.
Remarkable. I'm heartened to hear that. I wanted to begin by telling you something that you may find a little bit unusual coming from my lips, and that is that when I was a young fellow, I was a very, very happy, very, very loyal British subject. We had all the rights, all the privileges, and all the franchises of Englishmen over here in British America, at least the ones that were important to us. And most important of all, our lordly masters over in Great Britain pretty much left us alone for nigh on 150 years. I tell you this, and it is important for your understanding of your history and for the conveyance of this information to your students, because that means that we governed ourselves for 150 years. We raised our own funds when necessary. We adjudicated our own cases in our own courtrooms. Of course, all of that was going to change. Prior to the change, of course, I am born in Virginia. I am a boy raised on a farm, and I think it's very important. Everything that anyone needs to learn about life can be learned by being raised on a farm, in my opinion. While you may see me as a statesman or a soldier, I see myself first and foremost as a farmer. And I want to tell you, I become a surveyor for a while, but at the age of 21, I take up a sword for king and for country. It is at the same time that I purchase my commission, young Major Washington. Believe me, if I had more money, I would have purchased a higher commission. This is the way it was done in Europe and in Great Britain. I changed that in America. But if truth be told, I became an officer at a very interesting time because sabers were rattling once again between Great Britain and her hereditary enemy, France. And there was a situation that was arising in British America that focused on the Ohio country, the future of the continent. I, as a young man, volunteered and was traveling during the wintertime up to the Erie Lake, very close to the Erie Lake, Fort Le Boeuf, to hand an eviction notice to the French. Of course, the French representative that I handed this eviction notice to, he responded accordingly. In the French language, he said basically, au contraire. It is you British that must leave French land. You need to understand this disputed land was held by three great nations. The French, they claimed it based on exploration. LaSalle, 150 years earlier, left markers everywhere. The Indian nations, they claimed it based on residency. And of course, Great Britain claimed it based on royal proclamation. So it went down the hill after that mission. We ended up in a very significant shooting war. This was a war of empire, fought as far away as the Philippines and India, in Africa, Europe, and of course, extensively in North America as well. I tell you all of this because it is at this time in my life that I become aware of how our lordly masters over in Great Britain think about us here in British America. As an officer, a colonel, that's one step away from general, as commander of all the forces of Virginia, my orders could be overturned by a British captain or a lieutenant. And my soldiers were not paid the same amount of money for the exact same work as British regular soldiers were paid. This became a big problem. I understood the arrogance that our lordly masters in Great Britain had towards British American colonials. Ultimately, We are successful in pushing the French out of virtually all of North America. And then for a variety of reasons, I resigned my commission as commander of the Virginia forces. I have shared with you some of those concerns and problems I had. My friends will tell you I resigned for a very different reason. A lady, and perhaps they were correct, I was engaged to the widow of Colonel Daniel Custis. In the year of our Lord 1759, Mrs. Martha Dandridge Custis became Mrs. Washington. What a night that was. A story for another day, I will tell you. Mrs. Washington and I enjoy 16 uninterrupted years of great pleasure here at Mount Vernon, but things were changing dramatically. You see, 5, 6 years after we were wed, 1764, the King of England opens up his counting house and it is nigh on empty. He has almost a fit of apoplexy. Great Britain is almost bankrupt. And he turns to his ministers and he says, "Do something about this." And his ministers say to the king, "Your Majesty, we just finished fighting a very expensive war against the French. Most of the cost was incurred in British America. Let us turn to the American colonials and we will refill your treasury." I tell you this because it is important to you and your students that you are clear about the fact that the French and Indian War, as we called it here in British America, was a direct causation of the War of American Independence. For the next 11 years, the Crown embarks upon a systematic, tyrannical application of despotism, and they strip us of our freedoms, our liberties, they usurp whatever freedoms we had, and they reach into our pockets in ways they had never done before. We come together as a result of insult after insult over an 11-year period, finally in Philadelphia, and we agree, for one thing, on non-importation of goods. We hit the British where it hurts. This results in a variety of reversals by the Crown and so forth and so on. But by and large, our problems do not go away. It's critical to your understanding of your history that you're clear about the fact that when we came together in Philadelphia City for that Philadelphia Congress or General Congress, we did not call it the First Continental Congress. We didn't know there would be a second one. Can't see the future. But when we came together, we were citizens of complete separate countries, absolute foreigners to each other. My country was Virginia. We agree, however, after that first Congress, where we came together as Americans for the very first time, to come back together 1 year later. It does not take a year. 6 months later, as a result of the events of April 19th, 1775, we are back in session. You know what happened on April 19th, 1775? Madam?
There was trouble up in Massachusetts.
There was. The British march on the towns of Lexington and Concord. They're going to arrest patriots, confiscate weapons and black powder. They are met by armed American resistance. The war is on. We come together as a Congress once again. We have a very full agenda. We agree to raise up arms against our king, something that no colony in the history of humankind had ever done successfully. We're going to do it against the most powerful fighting force in the entire world, British Army and the British Navy. Second order of business, we send a petition to the king. The king gives us his response 4 months or so later, and the response is very clear. You are in rebellion. And he lets us know that he will stop at nothing to bring the rebels to justice. And the third order of business in that session was to appoint a gentleman, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army of the United Colonies of America. We would not declare independency for 13 more months. My name was nominated by Mr. John Adams of Massachusetts Bay Colony. I'd only met the man 6 months earlier. He argues that the war's being fought in the North. Southerners will be hesitant about getting involved in a shooting war in the North, but the appointment of a Southerner, particularly one from Virginia, the most powerful and wealthiest colony, to lead the army in the North will bring us all together in this cause. I was appointed. I told the Congress that I thought it would be the ruination of my reputation, that I did not have the experience or military knowledge to succeed, but I told them that I would serve our glorious cause for no pay and for no profit. It then took me 2 days to write the news to Mrs. Washington. I sent her a letter, enclosed a copy of my will. She was not happy to receive that. And a promise. This was in June of 1775. I promised I'd be home on Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve. I did not tell her which one. I literally walked across the threshold of our home at Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve, 8.5 years later. without taking a single day's furlough during the entire War of Independence. You know how this war turns out. We as a people raise up these United States of America to make a better life for most, not all, most of the inhabitants of the land. And then we have to ask ourselves what kind of country we should be. And make no mistake about that, there were a wide range of options and opinions, including those ill-conceived who wanted to make me what? King. King George I of America. And I pushed that back in the strongest of rebuffs, but I understood the thinking. One last point that is critical to your understanding. At the time that we declare our American independence, and again at the time that we sign our Constitution, we are the only nation on earth, the only country in the world that is not under the control of kings and queens and lords and ladies and sheiks and viziers and potentates and caliphs and maharajas and mikados and emperors, even a czarina. We alone raise up a nation of laws that empowers, so I have been told, ultimately all of its citizens. We can continue as a good and great nation, a beacon light unto other nations, and we can overcome absolutely anything that we face as long as we come together in union. If we allow factions and divisions to tear us apart, well, that does not bode well for the future. I want to thank you for your attention. I remain your humble and your obedient servant. Mr. Jefferson.
I thank you, General. Quite the honor, quite the responsibility to follow you in your exhibition, in your recounting, if you will, your reflections, recollections in kind, much of which I hold as well, deep in my affections and in my memory. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to venture here to your bluffs over the mighty Potomac. This, of course, the second time I recall, but a short time ago I was here to encourage you to stand for the office of the presidency, despite, of course, the differences of opinion within your cabinet, that I felt our nation should go on, that the North and the South I want to hang upon that second administration that you would provide us, and remain united e pluribus unum, as the Romans would say. When I reflect as well of my upbringing, my opportunity to be born out west, there in the forest primeval, to reflect regardless of the station that I have acquired in our nation's new government, let alone across the globe, I still refer to myself as a savage of the wilderness. To reflect that when I had the opportunity to attend to a formal education there at a Latin school and later at Murray's Classical Academy, to acquaint myself with the wisdom of the ancient world and to realize indeed even in my youth that the prophets of the future will be found in the wisdom of our past. To have the opportunity to improve my education at the Old Royal College of William and Mary there in Williamsburg, where we first met, Your Excellency, though of course you were well acquainted with my father, Colonel Peter Jefferson, in kind a surveyor and a colonel of militia. To have these opportunities placed me better in mind of what was beginning to reveal itself long before our revolution began. And that is that we might not ever forget we were indeed governed by one royal family generation after generation. We were governed by their particular parliament, which is hereditary, half of it. You cannot be a member of the House of Peers unless you are the eldest son of a member of the House of Peers. Indeed, an element of great privilege unto whom but a few. And lest we forget that we were governed by their particular church, a church that had been able to evolve from a contest and conflict with another church that they had accused had become quite propertied, wealthy, and politically allied. And yet overthrowing the Prince of Rome, the Church of England establishing itself in kind. And yet to realize, though governed by the British monarchy 3,000 miles removed, we were beginning to realize something here in her colonies. And that, I ask you, was it only the Englishmen seeking an asylum here in North America? No, of course not. Who else was venturing here? The Scots, yes. They would never want to consider themselves English, would they? Nor the Irish, the Dutch, the industrious Dutch settling up the Hudson River, providing great prosperity in the port of New York, many others. The Germans, from the many kingdoms of the Germanies, proving to be our most successful farmers. In fact, as we meet here this day, the predominant population in the new Commonwealth of Pennsylvania remains German. His Excellency, of course, reminded us of the mortal enemy of England, the French, arriving here well before the English, claiming a great deal of this continent as their own, and yet I inquire of you, even well before the French who had arrived here. The Spaniards. You know, the British were so proud of their first permanent settlement there on Jamestown Island. Do you recall the year? 1607. Do you know 50 years before that, the Spaniards built a fort on the York River? We know as well some from the kingdoms of the Italies, but a few from the kingdoms of the Orient, perhaps even fewer from the kingdoms of the Russias, the Hebrews, seeking a new promised land. And I ask you as well, who would ever dare or be so bold to deny the African? We know well the majority were brought here against their will. And yet who would be so bold to deny the fact they were settled here from the earliest days? Were they not? Well before greater majority has arrived. And therefore, lest we forget, being governed by the British monarchy 3,000 miles removed, we were beginning to realize, indeed, we are becoming the less and less British, and the more and more American. Self-evident, is it not? A new breed, a new people, the likes of which the world has never seen before. And through many different tongues becoming one kindred tongue, particularly in a remarkable confab, if you will, a confabulation, a conversation among so many different peoples in recognition of what we're beginning to realize are our inherent rights. And yet being told, settled here in these colonies, the right to hold an opinion freely and to freely express your opinion is a British right. The right to have a newspaper printing opinions is a British right. The right to trial by jury, a British right. Oh, and it goes on, but the more people began to speak amongst themselves, the more they began to question, how could that be solely British right? I have that right, innate in nature. That nation from which I have come was to engage many of those rights freely. And altogether we began to realize that these are the rights that are given to mankind, not by any government and not by any ruler. These are the rights given to the family of man across this globe by nature and nature's God. The general is correct to reflect that indeed we were settled freely here, perhaps more freely than man had ever been in his entire history, particularly the farther west you were seated on the frontier, that we had come to taste the sweetness of liberty. Nobody was looking over our shoulders in the conduct of our life. And the greatest element was the opportunity in nature to freely move ourselves wherever we should choose and thereby seek to better our condition. An inherent right in nature indeed. The recognition that no, we are not all created equal in face and form. Now are we? Are we all created equal in mind? But I ask you this, are we all created equal in opportunity in nature? Is not that God who gave us life one who has given us all liberty as well? Is not nature born free? And who would ever be so bold to deny that inherent right unto another? Each and every soul. Once seeing these inalienable rights imposed upon, yes, as the general has so well related, we rose up, as I have written, in a frenzy of retaliation to what occurred in Concord and Lexington, and lest we forget, 2 weeks later here in Virginia in Williamsburg, when John Murray, the Earl of Dunmore, attempted to deprive the citizenry there of their munitions and arms in the arsenal. We rose up and thereby reclaiming those reins of self-government. Being familiar where we had been, we were once more capable to lead ourselves forward, and through the victory of our American Revolution to establish what has become known as Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new world order, the first nation in the history of mankind founded upon principle, not upon monarchy or upon aristocracy. Principles that have been argued and debated from time immemorial as to whether man is indeed capable of governing himself. Oh, some believe that he may not be. Oh, and they have found one another, have they not? They bound closely together in their particular coteries of privilege, and they have now begun to assume that our government has been formed, its laws as well, to protect whom? Them. From whom? Their fellow citizen. Now, I ask you this, in the midst of that controversy and that conundrum, where would man be more free upon this globe to hold that opinion than he is here, a citizen of our new nation, and at the same time to be opposed by his fellow man who has as well that equal liberty and freedom to hold his opinion freely and to freely express it, and yet who does believe in the principle of self-government, who does seek to collaborate with his fellow man in order to improve the condition of mankind. And truly, despite these differences of opinion, is it not unique that we have founded a nation, the government of which, if it goes too far in one direction, calls upon whom to come to the helm? The people, it should be. And if the government goes too far in another direction, to call upon whom to come to the helm to steady it? The people as well. That essential principle that the government is the servant, not the master. That it governs through the rights of the people, through the people themselves, freely given and freely renewed. These principles as well we find vested in our Declaration of American Independence, and I have frequently said therein is not one new or original thought. In fact, as the General knows, I have frequently expressed to him that I never came up with one new or original thought. Everything in our Declaration has already been written, it has already been argued, it has already been debated, and you may find it in the elementary books of public right, the works of Aristotle, Cicero, Algernon, Sidney, John Locke. And what I attempted to do, what the committee attempted in reviewing my work, what the delegates in the Continental Congress attempted to review of the committee's work was simply to shed the lofty sophisms and explain it all in clear and simple terms so that each and every soul might understand and comprehend it. Not a privileged few who had the opportunity simply because their family had the means to attend to an education, but that the great diversity of our population, which I've always said is our greatest strength, might come to understand the common sense of the matter, that matter, our American Revolution, to show the rest of the world that our American Revolution was fought on behalf of the common man, to provide the greatest good to the greatest number, and particularly to reveal that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a few booted and spurred ready to ride him. That is the message of our Declaration, and happily, though I was not there, to see it secured, the more so, in our Constitution. Now, grant you, I know, Colonel, and Your Excellency, that you recall when I was not so much in favor of an effort to strengthen our Articles of Confederation. I did believe they were of a venerable fabric. They should not be tampered with. But I also realized that there was no efficient method of taxation, and any more than there was an efficient method of electing the chief magistrate of our nation. And so there, while in France, continuing in communications with my friend Mr. Madison, I learned of the business, the progress of our Constitutional Convention. And when finally I received that first draft of the Constitution in a letter written by Mr. Madison, that was November 1787, I wrote back to him, "Rest you assured, I am captivated by this document." Captivated, the shortest document of its kind in human history, creating a government to check its own power, recognizing the greater influence within the three branches is what? The legislative branch. That branch elected directly by whom? The people. And yet I said this document does fall short because it could be read by any government in power to its own particular means and ends. It needs something most essential, that which all people are entitled to upon this earth against any government on this earth. What this Constitution needs is, I'm delighted you've become familiar with it, a Bill of Rights, which continues to allow the government in the hands of the people. Citizens, this much we know: if men were angels, governments would not be necessary. But of course we have the question, do we not? And that is, did we find angels in the forms of kings to govern us? No, this is now in our hands. This is in our laps, and let history answer the question. We have formed a government upon principle. The principle of any government, in my opinion, is tripartite. Firstly, the general safety. Secondly, the general defense. And thirdly, a general system of taxation to support the general safety and the general defense. The only purpose of government is simply to protect its citizenry from injury by one another, but otherwise to leave them free, that they might pursue their own industry and their own improvement. I'm cautious that if we allow our government to decide that it could very well in itself become a business unto itself, then what will happen, citizens? We know what will happen. Further taxes in order to support it. I am not one who disagrees in the elements of compromise and resolution. As the General has cited, we succeeded in showing the rest of the world that we can bring 13 individual nations together. But not only for our common safety, and not only for our common defense, but lest we forget, particularly as Americans, for the common good. Thank you.
Colonel.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Jefferson. In the general course of human nature, the power over a man's subsistence amounts to nothing more or less than the power over his will. Thus it is that the position of a Secretary of Treasury is one fraught with responsibility, for whoever controls the purse strings of a nation, to a certain extent, controls that nation. Now, during the late perturbations of our so-called sister Republic of France, I've had occasion to have Charles de Perigord de Talleyrand staying with myself and my family. And he finds it the most extraordinary thing that I, as Secretary of the Treasury, do not do as most European ministers of finance, take a bit for myself. Apparently it is quite the accustomed thing to do there, so much so that the salary of a minister of finance is quite negligible, for it is quite presumed that they will be taking a bit for themselves. Now, that of course is absolutely reprehensible, and we will not have that here. But I have been accused of malfeasance in my office on numerous occasions. I have been even brought before a committee of investigation of the House of Representatives who, if it was not paneled with those whom had an outright dislike for me, it was paneled by those who were my outright enemies. And I have been exonerated each and every several time. One cannot aspire to political office, though, without accruing enemies. Mine have been most vocal in their denunciations. My detractors seem to think that they can evince a justness to their case and win converts to their cause by the loudness of their declamations and the bitterness of their invectives. I will use reason. John Adams, in his time, has been wont to say that I am a great hypocrite and an insolent coxcomb. That's right, I said coxcomb. Although John Adams was once referred to as a monkey just put into breeches, so I think I fare rather better in comparison. Now, when the committee was drafting the Declaration of Independence back in 1776, I, along with His Excellency General Washington, was fighting in New York. New York is not my native city. It is, I do not know if you know this, but I am not native to these shores. I was born in the British West Indies. I'm not certain if you're familiar, but in the British West Indies, the population is chiefly about 80% slave and about 20% white. Therefore, there are always great fears of slave insurrections. Therefore, it is necessary for every lad of 13 years or older to go to the local fort and learn to march and drill with the soldiery. Thus it was I had some experience when the war came to us in New York, and I was a student there studying at King's College or Columbia, I think, in your day. The war came to us. Now, I don't know if you know how the battles worked in and around New York. Do you know? Well, they worked out brilliantly if you were in the British Army. In the Continental Army, not too well at all. We were forced to retreat the length of York Island, or Manhattan Island, I think, in your day, and retreat into New Jersey. Now, retreating is a dismal business at best, but there is no more dismal place to retreat through than New Jersey. I see you being. We had to retreat the length of New Jersey, crossing the Delaware into Pennsylvania. Now, what happens on December 25th? Anyone? Someone said Christmas. Christmas happens every year, you godless heathen. I should be more specific. What happens on December 25th, 1776?
March back to New Jersey.
That's right. We recrossed the Delaware, surprising Colonel Rahl and his Hessians at Trenton. I tell you, my favorite view of Trenton is down the barrel of a cannon. Now, a few days later, General Lord Cornwallis sought to entrap us in Trenton, and General Washington was able to slip away. We were able to countermarch, and we took them at Princeton instead. I don't suppose any of you would know this, but before the war, I had applied to the College of New Jersey at Princeton and been denied. Well, as the 40th and 55th Regiments of Foot fell back on Nassau Hall, I got into the College of New Jersey at Princeton with cannon. Although I suppose if some of you were to seek higher university learning, you perhaps ought to use pen and paper. Cannon only worked for myself, and then they closed the school shortly thereafter. Now, in the aftermath of the battles of Trenton and Princeton, His Excellency General Washington did me the honor of asking me to become one of his aides-de-camp. An aide-de-camp is a sort of military secretary, if you will. The duties of an aide-de-camp are many and varied. They include the interrogation of prisoners, the interrogation of spies, very infrequently acting in the general's name, but more often than not, it is the day-to-day administration of the army. For every order that is given must be written. And who do you suppose did all that writing?
You did.
We did, the aides-de-camp, writing for the general day in, day out. And it became quite tedious. And I'd begun the war with a field commission, and I am in so many ways an old soldier. And were we to have a standing army, as is completely appropriate, then I think that I should be a part of that army. Instead, I find myself in government. Now, I'm very often asked why I feel the way I do, why I feel we need such a strong federal government. If I may, I would like to take you back to the war very briefly. Now, when you start a war, when I was an aide-de-camp to General Washington, it was part of my job to help him feed and clothe the army. Now, when you start a war, and the precept of that war is you do not want to pay taxes, how do you feed and clothe that army? Well, you don't. Now, of course, it is a gross misrepresentation for me to say we didn't want to pay taxes. No taxation without representation, as James Otis would have it. Odd little man that he is. But what it meant, in effect, was that people weren't paying their taxes. Taxes in those days were all paid by the, well, they were collected by the individual states and then passed on to the federal government. I suppose you know how that worked. The states would collect the taxes, they would use what they needed, and then before passing it on to the federal government, they'd look about and say, oh, you know, there's a bridge that needs mending over here, and the streets need recobbling. Oh, the ports are a mess. Well, by the time the states had done with it, there was rarely anything left to pass on to the federal government. The system of government we had at the time, you know what it was, yes? During the war, we had a government under the Articles of Confederation. Now, what were some of its difficulties? It was just a legislature. A legislature. There was no executive, there was no judiciary. A legislature that did not even have the power to collect its own taxes. This led to, as your own James Madison would say, the anarchy of our system. Now, I remember on the retreat through New Jersey, it was my custom at that time to walk alongside the cannon, and I would pat the cannon as I would walk along, absorbed in thought, and I couldn't help but notice the tracks in front of me, the wagon wheels, the hoof prints of the horses, and the footprints of the men. Very often shod, but very often, like as not, unshod. You know, cold goes through leather like that. And when leather becomes completely saturated or permeated due to inclement conditions, it becomes very dry and brittle upon drying, unless it's treated immediately. And it begins to crack and fall away. And the men would try to tie the shoes on their feet with rags and scraps, but ultimately they would fall away, and we would be looking at bare footprints in the snow and the muck and the mire. And then, of course, because skin itself is nothing more than leather, that too would begin to crack and open up. And we would be looking at bloody footprints in the snow and the muck and the mire. We saw it all throughout the war. Yes, General? We saw it at Valley Forge. We saw it in the retreat through New Jersey. We saw it at Morristown. I began to ask myself, why have we come to such desperate straits? Why can we not find proper sustenance for our troops? Men give me some credit for genius. All the genius I have lies in this. When I have a subject in hand, my mind becomes pervaded by it. Day and night it is before me. I plumb the problem to its very depths. Then the results of my reflections, some men are pleased to call the fruit of genius. It is not. It is the fruit of labor and thought. And when I plumbed this problem to its depths, what was the result? It was the form of government we had at the time, the Articles of Confederation, a loose form of government that did not even have the power to collect its own taxes. Thus it is that we need the strong federal government that we have. We need the government that we set up under the Constitution. And though I will own, I'm very often asked my opinion of the Constitution, and I will tell you I never expect to see perfect work from imperfect man. And though I think there was not a man of us who was satisfied with the document when we left Philadelphia that day, we all knew we had something we could work with. Now, the document begins, I think you know, as Secretary Jefferson was intoning on the people and the rights of the people. And make no mistake, I believe that the people have a right to rule. Here, the people rule, but they do it through their elected representatives in the House of Representatives, as is, of course, the way it ought to be. Now, it has frequently been remarked, and it seems to be reserved to the people of this country, by their conduct and example, to decide the important question whether societies of men are capable or not of establishing good government from. Shall we be no more fit for the whip or the spur, or can we indeed govern ourselves? We have that capability, but we must do it together as 13 states of one nation. I think perhaps you are all familiar with the beginning of the Constitution, which begins, "We the people of the United States." Yes. Now, but I suspect perhaps you are not familiar with the first draft of the Constitution, which read, "We the people of the states of Connecticut, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Delaware, etc., 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 sending a very different message to the world than "we the people of the United States." It is as Dr. Franklin has been wont to say, though he wasn't speaking of this at the time, I think it holds true here as well. We must all hang together, or we will assuredly most all hang separately. Thank you for your kind attentions.
Well, at the risk of boring these people further, and with some trepidation, to be strictly honest with you, I do have a question to put on the table, and that is, where are the two of you in your joint and several opinions with regard to our debt?
Shall you begin, or shall I?
I should like to have a first statement, if you would allow, Colonel. The debt of our nation is something that we attended to from the very beginning in the engaging of our American Revolution. It is something that we had to attend to, that has been known well throughout the history of man to be a necessity of war. The raising of funds for the conducting of that war, the engaging of loans for the payment of that war, the issuing of scrip that can be given as promissories for those soldiers who might not otherwise see an end in sight for their benefit, and to make certain that once these soldiers become our nation's revered veterans, that they might return to their homes and see their cash boxes to be refilled, if you will, with the monies as a result of their hard-earned labors, not to be depleted of those monies, nor to have lost those notes unto stock jobbers and speculators who assume it to be their duty to pursue the future of these soldiers, let alone the future of our nation in their particular hands, for whose benefit? Their particular benefit. This, Your Excellency, I consider to be the curse if you will, of the accrual of credit and a deficit of monies within our new nation. Now, realizing it had to be assuaged, realizing that there must be some method by which we may repay this debt, yes, I was very anxious to receive the report on manufactures, very anxious to receive the idea of assumption of the debts of this nation in the form of a bill that Colonel Hamilton put forth, and coincidentally at the same time that our nation was considering the placement of our federal city. Curious, is it not, that our nation's government, federal government at that time, was seated in New York, a center of counting houses, a center of merchants and financiers, men of commerce and mercantilism. Those who might forget, if you will, though they live in one of our nation's 7 large cities, beyond 20,000 in population, that 9 out of every 10 Americans lives where? On a farm. Again, those who might forget. And curious indeed, as Your Excellency called us unto your house there at the Bowling Green, the President's house, to present our concerns, my concern being simply that the Assumption Bill might engage our nation into further debt for generations yet unborn, and that it was my concern that we situate our federal city in the land of farmers, not within that of the counting houses of financiers. You recall, Your Excellency, that as we appeared before you, the two of us, you could not readily make a decision with what we had to pronounce verbally, but requested us to write down squarely our concerns, which is your usual wont, that we enumerate our concerns and then place that before you, that you might take the time to decide. As we accomplished that, and several days passed, you returned the answer that you were in a great state of uncertainty.
Could not decide.
And therefore, you left the matter unto the two of us to decide for the future of our nation. A collaborative effort, which I certainly would not shirk any more than Colonel Hamilton. And yet we realized that we needed a mediator. We needed someone else who might be there and help enlighten us to a compromise and a resolution. And I believe all of you know of whom I am referring to, do you not? The mighty little Madison, the most luminous mind I have ever known, who knows more about ancient history and ancient civilizations and nations applicable to what is best to maintain the common good in this modern world. And therefore, seated at a repast there on the corner of Pearl and Maiden Street, the three of us, if you recall, Colonel, came to a compromise, and that is simply that you, sir, would seek to influence your northern supporters to accept the idea of the Residency Act in the South, to place our nation's capital below the Mason and Dixon, along a navigable waterway, perhaps half in Virginia, half in Maryland, below the fall lines of such a river. And at the same time that I would encourage my Southern supporters to accept the idea of the Assumption Bill, even if it meant that Virginia and the Carolinas would have to pay their war debt once again. The compromise was made with the idea that this debt would become a principle of government to make payment every year until it was finally eradicated. Was it not? Was that not your premise of that compromise? That it should become a principle of good government to pay off the debt every year. Make that initial and continuous effort to do so every year and see the debt paid off within a short period of time. And yes, did we not come to agreement that a central currency would be necessary? I myself took the initiative to draw up a standard of currency based upon the decimal system, sir. I agreed that this would bring us closer together to solidify a united effort to pay off the debt, provide a standard of currency betwixt Massachusetts and Georgia. That is what we had in mind. And then what did we find within but a year or so? Suddenly the idea to be fully enforced of a national bank. A national bank to provide the direction, to provide the authority, to provide the administration. You remember my immediate reply, sir, to your concerted effort in that regard? Where in our Constitution does it even infer the creation of a national bank?
There are implied as well as express powers written into the Constitution.
I ask you, are we to rest upon inference on such an important subject as the finance of our nation? Grant you this, sir, I am not denying that we have within our Constitution a means to create a debt. Yes, Article 1, Section 8, the enumeration of the powers of the legislative body. Yes, but in times of war, Colonel Hamilton, in times of war where there is a dire necessity, not to fuel, if you will, elements of usury in the hands of those who can afford to purchase.
In times that are necessary, not necessarily just in times of war, when it is absolutely necessary. In my duties as Secretary of the Treasury, the Congress ordered me, in addition to the series of cutters we've created to guard our eastern coast against the smuggling going on, I was ordered to set up a series of lighthouses along our eastern shores.
Oh,
now, nowhere in the Constitution does it state that we may have a lighthouse, and yet it became necessary to build one. If we can build a lighthouse, we can build a bank.
And I agree we can build lighthouses, sir, because that is essential to our nation's safety and defense. We are agreed as well upon the idea of militia boats for the defense of our coastline. We are agreed as well on a universal system of education to improve our citizenry, particularly that they might recognize the principles upon which our nation has been founded and not err or stray too far from them. But the idea of this national bank in such a convoluted form, I could not understand it. Many of the members of the Congress could not understand it. In fact, as I have written, I doubt even Colonel Hamilton himself understood it. But the purpose of the matter was not so much that the Congress comprehended as the Colonel desired to have accomplished. No, what he desired to have accomplished was what? The sale. The sale. Simply buy it now. And therefore, sir, would you not agree? Would you not enjoy very much to, say, risk the possibility of becoming rich rather than to face the reality of being poor?
That is hardly.
Here's the carrot, sir. Grab at it if you choose, but mind yourself. Whatever the capital you put forth, others have had the opportunity to match it perhaps tenfold.
Our nation's finances in the early days were in a woeful state. We were $80 million in debt, if you can imagine. 80 million. Now, my system for handling the finance was threefold. First, the assumption of the war debt. It was absolutely imperative that that pass. Second, to take the debt, convert it into interest-bearing bonds, and sell those bonds on the open market. And third, the establishment of the national bank. One thing hinging on the other. It is, if without one part, the whole thing might fail. So we needed all of it. Now, as to the assumption bill, we needed to all assume that debt. We were, at that time, 13 separate countries, if you will, all with our own negotiations with foreign countries, whoever our debtors were, and we were getting the worst deals possible. Moreover, there were great fears that we would not pay, and there were great fears that we would default. The several states would default. Can you imagine a time when the states are in danger of defaulting? Was I amusing? All right. Now, by all assuming the debt, we establish our credit. We also assure our debtors that we will in fact pay. And by doing that, we establish our credit, which is absolutely imperative that we do so. States, like individuals who keep their engagements or pay their bills, are respected and trusted. And the reverse is true of those who pursue an opposite conduct. Were we to allow the state of Massachusetts to fall into default, it were the worst, blackest name on us as a nation. The eyes of the world are upon this nation. We are the great experiment, and we must proceed with the greatest conduct. Now, second part, the selling of bonds, right? Now, it is a strange perversion of ideas, and an idea as novel as it is strange, that men should be deemed corrupt and criminal for wanting to become proprietors in the welfare of their nation, either through purchasing government shares or government bonds from a national bank, which leads us, of course, to the national bank, which we have every right to have. If we can build a lighthouse, we can build a bank. And the bank is necessary. It is absolutely necessary. for the stabilization of our currency, to give us greater facility in the collection of taxes, and to give us loans in time of need. All absolutely necessary.
Necessary, if you will, to secure a future monarchy of ownership, while the general citizen body continue to deplete their coffers in being led along the idea that perhaps they might no longer have to reside upon farms. Why endeavor such an overbearing livelihood when they might be the more successful to reside in urban markets, and thereby to become dependent upon another for their sustenance rather than the cultivation of the soil? I ask you, citizens, again to reflect upon our nation, predominantly seated with farmers, those the chosen upon this earth, who provide, if you will, the principles of self-government by holding the reins of the cultivation of soil in their hands, providing directly their sustenance, the sustenance of their families, the sustenance of their neighborhood, the sustenance of our nation. Could you imagine our nation of farmers deciding it is time that we leave our farms and resettle in the centers of counting houses?
May I ask both of you gentlemen to kindly take your seats?
Your Excellency.
General.
I hope you are clear upon the fact that I will not seek a third term. Mr. Jefferson, I don't believe that this is a debate in its truest sense with regard to city men versus farmers. And I say that from the perspective of a farmer. Colonel Hamilton, I do not believe that it is easy to put in place and enforce programs that the common man does not fully understand. But to use your own words, Thomas, it was you that said a difference of principle does not, a difference of opinion does not necessarily mean
Precisely, and I'm not the first. It is an ancient adage indeed.
You know, gentlemen, I will tell you that faction and division, it has its place in terms of warming the debate and the discussion. But left unchecked, it becomes a consuming flame. I am reminded of a story of the final day of the Constitutional Convention. It was the day in which we had signed the document, 17 September, 1787. And I had been the presiding officer at that convention. I had thanked all the delegates for their service and dismissed each and every one of them. I was up on the dais putting my papers together, and I heard a tap, tap, tapping approaching the dais, and I look up and there is Dr. Franklin of blessed memory. I stepped down off the dais. I took his arm immediately. I said, "Doctor, how can I help you, sir?" And may I, Thomas?
Yes.
He took his crabtree walking stick with the gold cap, his most prized possession, if truth be told, a possession in which he left to me in his will. And he started pointing it. And he said, "General, throughout these proceedings, I have been looking at your chair." I said to him, "Doctor, I don't understand what you're talking about." And he said, through wincing in great pain, you need to understand, he suffered from the gout. He had stones in his kidneys. There were days where he could not even walk into the proceedings of this constitutional settlement. He would be brought in on a litter carried on the shoulders of 4 prisoners from the Walnut Street jail. Yet he stood there, I at his elbow. Again, he raises his crabtree walking stick. He said, "Your chair, General, your chair. I have been looking at your chair." I said, "Forgive me, Doctor, I still do not ken to what you're saying." And he went on to tell me that throughout these proceedings, with the great rancor and the great divisions and the faction that would arise, wealthy states versus poor states, large states versus small states, free states versus slave states. He said, I saw this union coming crashing to the ground before it could stand. And yet today, General, and I will tell you he had a tear in his eye, today, General, we have signed this document. What he was referring to on my chair was that there was a sun carved on the horizon. And he had said to me, when painters paint a sun on the horizon, or woodcarvers carve a sun on the horizon, you cannot tell if it is a rising sun or a setting one. And of course, on the shoulder board of my chair was a beautiful sun carved on the horizon, gilded. This is what he was pointing at. And this is what he was referring to when he said to me, today I have the great happiness to report that it is a rising sun on America and not a setting one. I tell you this, and I remind you, gentlemen, this, in that we will not succeed unless we do so with amity and mutual concession, that we will not stand as a union unless we stand together, and that we can accomplish anything, as I mentioned earlier. We can accomplish anything as long as we do so in union. I speak on behalf of Secretary Jefferson and Secretary Hamilton in thanking you, and we all three remain your humble and your obedient servants.
Thank you, John.
Thank you kindly.